The promise was spoken easy, like most lies and a few truths out west. Right there at sundown, when the sky burned copper and the wind smelled of dust and old regrets. He said it without looking at her at first, just tipping his hat and loosening the reins of his horse. I can take you to the next town come morning. Nothing more than a ride, nothing owed. The words hung between them like a coin spinning in the air. Not yet heads or tails, and the girl standing there, boots worn thin and eyes too old for her face, nodded like she'd learned long ago not to ask for better terms. She had come out of the sagebrush like a ghost, coat too big, hands trembling not from the cold but from the waiting. And Clay Mercer, a man who'd sworn he was done picking up strays, felt that old tightening in his chest he pretended was just the weather turning. Clay Mercer had a reputation that stretched thin across 3 counties. Some said he was fair, some said he was dangerous. Most agreed he kept to himself and minded his own land. The Cross Spur ranch sat lonely between dry hills and a river that forgot to run half the year. Clay liked it that way, liked the quiet that came with fences straight and gates closed. He'd buried too many promises already, a wife under a mesquite tree, a brother in a shallow grave marked by stones, and since then he'd lived by rules carved deep. Help no one you can't afford to lose. Let the past stay buried. Keep moving forward, even when forward feels like nowhere. That was before the girl with the dust-colored hair stepped into his evening and asked for nothing more than a ride. She didn't give her name at first, just said she was heading east, that the next town would do. Any town with lights and people and a place to disappear into. Her voice carried the flat sound of someone used to being interrupted or ignored. Clay studied her, the way a rancher studies a horse with a limp. Careful, suspicious, already guessing at the cost. She couldn't have been more than 19, though the hard lines around her mouth said she'd lived double that. There was a bruise yellowing along her wrist, half hidden by her sleeve, and a split lip, she said, came from falling. Clay didn't argue. He'd learned that pushing too hard only made people shut down. He just nodded and told her she could sleep in the barn, pointed her to the water pump, and went back to fixing a fence that didn't really need fixing that night. The wind rose and rattled the tin roof. Coyotes sang somewhere beyond the far pasture, and Clay lay awake, staring at the ceiling of his cabin, listening to the unfamiliar sound of someone breathing on his land. It had been years since anyone stayed the night, years since he'd shared a fire or a meal with anyone who wasn't passing through. He told himself it was temporary. Come morning he'd saddle up, point the horse east, and by sundown she'd be someone else's problem, someone else's story. But when dawn came, pale and quiet, and he stepped outside to find her already up, feeding the chickens like she'd done it 100 times before, something shifted, small but stubborn, like a stone in his boot he couldn't shake. They ate in silence. Coffee, strong and bitter, bread hard from yesterday. She thanked him softly and finally offered her name. Ellie, just Ellie, no last name, no history she wanted to share. Clay didn't press. Instead, he asked where she learned to handle animals so gentle. She shrugged and said, when you don't have much, you learn to take care of what you do get. The words hit him harder than he expected. After breakfast, he saddled his horse, tied on a second mount he kept for emergencies, and told her to gather her things. We'll leave before the heat sets in, he said, meaning it, fully intending to see the promise through and nothing more. The road stretched dusty and familiar. He'd ridden it 100 times alone. Today it felt different, like the land itself was watching. They hadn't gone more than a mile when the trouble found them. A rider crested the hill behind, then another, then a third, moving fast and careless. Ellie stiffened beside him. Her hand went white around the saddle horn. Clay felt it then, that cold certainty that comes right before violence. He turned his horse and watched them approach, recognized the lead man by the way he leaned forward. Jeb Carter, a small-time thug with big-time cruelty, the kind of man who enjoyed chasing what ran. He tipped his hat with a grin that never touched his eyes. "Morning, Mercer," he drawled. "Looks like you got something that belongs to me." Ellie's breath hitched, and Clay knew in that moment the ride to the next town was already turning into something else. Entirely, Clay didn't reach for his gun. Not yet. He kept his voice even and said, "You're mistaken, friend. She's just passing through. Same as me." Jeb laughed and spat into the dust. Said passing through didn't usually leave bruises behind. Said Ellie had a habit of stealing, of lying, of causing trouble. Ellie shook her head, tears bright but whispered, "Please, Clay, don't let him take me back." The word back settled heavy in Clay's gut, because back meant more than a place, it meant a cage. And Clay had broken enough cages in his life to recognize one when he saw it. He made his choice right there, quick and quiet. Like most choices that change everything, he nudged his horse forward just a step and said, "You best turn round, Jeb. Because she's under my protection now." The gunfire was short and loud. Dust exploding, horses screaming. When it was over, Jeb lay bleeding in the dirt. Not dead, but not chasing anyone either. The others fled fast. Clay reholstered his gun with hands steadier than he felt. Ellie stared at him like he'd just pulled her out of a grave. "You didn't have to do that," she said, voice shaking. Clay looked down the road, then back toward the Cross Spur, already knowing the truth, even if he didn't say it yet. Trouble follows trouble, and now it knew his name. "We're not going to the next town today," he said finally, turning his horse around. She asked where they were going then. Clay exhaled slow. "Back home," he said, and with that the promise of a simple ride faded, replaced by something heavier, something that felt a lot like responsibility. And maybe, if he was honest with himself, the beginning of belonging for them both. The Cross Spur looked different on the ride back, like the land itself had shifted its weight. Now that trouble knew the way. Ellie rode quiet beside Clay, eyes always drifting to the hills as if she expected men to rise out of the dust at any moment. Clay felt the same pull in his gut, that old warning he hadn't listened to since the day he buried his brother. He told himself bringing her back was temporary, just until things cooled, but even he didn't believe it, because when they crossed the gate and she let out a breath she'd been holding since dawn, something settled into place that felt dangerous and right all at once. He showed her the bunkhouse instead of the barn this time, handed her a clean blanket, and said, "You can stay a few days, no questions, no strings." She nodded like she'd learned not to trust kindness that came without a price. But when he turned away he saw her fingers brush the doorframe like she was memorizing it, just in case it disappeared. Days passed slower than Clay expected, the kind of slow that sneaks up on a man. Ellie worked without being asked, fixed fence wire with hands already scarred by other kinds of labor, cooked meals that tasted like memory even though Clay couldn't place where from, and spoke only when she needed to. But when she did, there was a sharp intelligence behind her words. She knew how men like Jeb operated, how they circled until you were too tired to fight back. One evening by the fire she told Clay pieces of her story. Not all of it, just enough. She'd run from a place that wasn't a home, from a man who believed ownership came with fists. Clay listened with his jaw set tight, seeing too much of his sister in her words, too much of his own failures. He didn't offer comfort, just said, "No one lays a hand on you here, not while I'm breathing." And for the first time she looked at him like she believed it might be true. Trouble didn't take long to follow. It never did. A stranger rode by the fence one afternoon, slow and curious. Clay watched from the porch, thumb hooked in his belt. Ellie stood behind him without thinking, close enough that he could feel her presence like heat against his back. The rider didn't stop, just tipped his hat and moved on. But the message was clear. Jeb's people were sniffing around. That night, Clay doubled the watch, cleaned his rifle, and lay awake listening to the wind move through the grass. He realized then how much he had to lose. Not the ranch, not the land, but the fragile, quiet Ellie had started to build. The way she laughed once when the mule kicked over a bucket, the way she hummed while sweeping the porch. These were small things, but they rooted deep, and Clay had learned the hard way that anything worth keeping usually drew blood. Ellie changed too, though she didn't notice it herself. She slept through the night more often, stopped flinching at sudden sounds, began asking questions about the ranch, like she might have a future there. Clay taught her how to ride fence properly, how to read the sky for weather, how to stand her ground without inviting a fight. She learned fast, faster than most hands he'd hired back when he still hired anyone at all. One afternoon she asked him why he lived so far from town, why he stayed alone. Clay answered with half-truths, said towns had memories he didn't need, didn't mention the grave under the mesquite or the promises he'd broken. Ellie didn't push, just nodded like she understood more than he'd said. Sometimes understanding was quieter than asking. The first real test came at dusk, shots fired near the north fence. Clay grabbed his rifle and Ellie followed before he could tell her to stay back. Two riders were cutting wire, bold now, careless. Clay shouted, warning them off. One bolted, the other raised his gun. Ellie didn't freeze, didn't scream. She moved the way someone moves when they've already survived worse. Shoved Clay aside as the shot rang out, The bullet grazed his arm instead of his chest. Clay dropped the man with one clean shot. When the dust settled, Ellie stood shaking but standing, eyes fierce and wet. "You said this was my home now," she said, voice breaking. "I'm not letting anyone take it." Clay looked at her then, not like a stray he'd picked up, but like a partner who'd chosen the fight alongside him. That night they burned the cut wire, and sat by the fire longer than usual. The stars stretched wide and cold above them. Ellie finally cried, not loud, just steady, like something long damned had found a crack. Clay didn't say a word, just sat close enough that she could lean if she wanted to, and she did, resting her head against his shoulder, like it was the most natural thing in the world. Clay felt the weight of it, the trust, heavier than any saddle. He knew then that sending her away would be another kind of betrayal, one he wasn't sure he could live with. When she fell asleep, right there by the fire, Clay stayed awake, keeping watch, understanding fully now that the promise of a ride had turned into a vow. Unspoken but binding, the ranch began to feel alive again. Not just land and labor, but something shared. Ellie suggested planting a small garden near the creek bed. Said food tasted better when you grew it yourself. Clay helped without comment, hands in the dirt beside hers. He hadn't planted anything since his wife died. Watching green push through hard ground did something to him. Reminded him that survival wasn't the same as living. Still, the threat hung over them. Jeb wouldn't let this go. Men like him never did. Clay prepared quietly, fixed old traps, counted ammunition, made plans he hoped he wouldn't need. Ellie noticed but didn't ask. She was learning the language of men like Clay, the way silence often carried the heaviest truths. By the end of the week, the choice lay plain between them, though neither spoke it aloud. Staying meant fighting, leaving meant running. Ellie stood at the edge of the porch one morning, looking out over the land like she was measuring herself against it. She said, "I can still go, if you want me to." Clay didn't answer right away, watched a hawk circle overhead, then said, "This place doesn't give up easy, but it keeps what stands its ground." Ellie smiled then, small and brave, and Clay knew the final reckoning was coming, because the West never lets a man keep something precious without demanding payment. And when Jeb Carter returned, it wouldn't be for words. Jeb Carter came back the way storms do in dry country, sudden, loud, and with no intention of passing quietly. It started just after dawn when the dogs began barking and the horses shifted uneasy in the corral. Clay was already awake, rifle across his knees, because some nights a man just knows sleep is finished with him. Ellie stepped onto the porch beside him, wrapped in a coat too big but standing tall inside it, and there they were on the rise beyond the creek. 5 riders this time, spread wide, no rush, no hiding. Jeb at the center with his hat pulled low, and his smile sharp as broken glass. He raised a hand in mock greeting and called out that it didn't have to end bloody. All Clay had to do was hand over what didn't belong to him. Ellie's jaw tightened, her fingers curled slow and steady. Clay felt the choice pressed down hard, the kind that decides what kind of man you'll be remembered as. He stepped forward and said, "This ends today." One way or another, the first shot came from the left, wild and impatient, and then the world narrowed to sound and motion. Hooves tearing dirt, gunfire cracking the morning open. Clay moved the way memory taught him, calm inside the chaos. Ellie stayed close but not helpless. She reloaded, passed ammunition, watched the angles like she'd been born to it. One of Jeb's men went down near the fence. Another bolted when Clay's bullet shattered his shoulder. But Jeb kept coming, shouting curses, firing without care. The ranch took the beating with them. Fence posts splintered, dust rose thick as smoke. When it was over, only Clay and Jeb were left standing, facing each other across trampled ground. Jeb laughed then, said, "You always were a stubborn bastard, Mercer." Clay answered by lowering his rifle and telling Ellie to stay back. This part was his. They walked toward each other slow, guns low but ready. The silence, heavy with all the things men never say. Jeb talked, because men like him always do. Said Ellie owed him, said Clay was a fool to throw his life away for someone broken. Clay listened until the words ran out, then said broken things can still be fixed, and some things deserve protecting no matter the cost. Jeb sneered and went for his gun, but Clay was faster. The shot rang clean and final. Jeb fell hard into the dirt he'd never cared for. The echo rolled out across the hills and faded. Ellie rushed forward, breath caught, eyes wide. Clay stood still a moment longer, letting the truth of it settle, then lowered his gun. The fight was over. but the weight of it stayed. They buried Jeb and the others beyond the north fence, marked the ground plain and quiet. Clay didn't feel triumph, just a deep tiredness that sank into his bones. Ellie stood beside him, hand brushing his arm, not asking, just there. The law came days later, asked questions, listened to answers, and rode away satisfied. Out here justice was often measured by survival. When the dust finally cleared, the ranch stood scarred but standing. Fences could be fixed, buildings rebuilt. But something else had changed. Something that wouldn't blow away with the next wind. Weeks passed, and the Cross Spur settled into a new rhythm. Ellie moved through the place like she belonged, because now she did. She planted the garden she'd talked about, green pushing stubborn through the soil. Clay found himself laughing more, sleeping better. The quiet no longer felt empty. One evening Ellie asked him if he ever regretted staying. Clay looked out over the land, the sun dropping low and gold, and said he regretted a lot of things, but not this, not her. She smiled then, the kind of smile that doesn't ask permission, and Clay felt the last of his walls give way. Ellie told him one night she'd never had a place that didn't expect something in return. Clay answered that this land asked plenty: work, patience, grit, but it gave back if you stayed true. She nodded like she understood that kind of bargain. They talked about the future in careful pieces. More land fenced, more crops planted, maybe a hand or two hired come spring. It wasn't dreaming big, just building steady. The way lasting things are made. The day Ellie finally rode into town again wasn't an escape, it was a choice. Clay rode beside her, not ahead, not behind. People noticed, nodded, some whispered, but Ellie held her head high. She wasn't running anymore. When they returned at dusk, the Cross Spur welcomed them back with open gates and lowing cattle. Clay realized then that the promise he'd made had changed shape. What started as a ride had become a shared road. One neither of them walked alone that night. They sat on the porch as the stars came out one by one. Ellie leaned into Clay, easy and sure, and said, "Funny how a man can promise you a ride and give you a life instead." Clay smiled, slow and honest, said, "Sometimes the West decides for you." The wind moved through the grass, the land held them both, and for the first time in a long while, Clay Mercer felt like he was home, not because he stood alone on his land, but because someone stood with him, choosing to stay.